Okay, settle in. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a serious plunge into a period that absolutely fundamentally shaped the modern world. It really set the stage for so much of what we see in international relations even today.
It really is a crucial era. We're talking about the Cold War,
Hmm.
a time of intense ideological struggle, geopolitical chess, and frankly, moments that brought the world terrifyingly close to the brink.
Exactly. And we have this incredibly detailed document guiding us, almost like a historical blueprint, you could say. It helps us navigate the complexities of this really critical period.
hmm
Our mission here is to cut through the noise, pull out the essential insights, understand how this confrontation became so deeply
The
institutionalized,
structures behind it.
revisit the flashpoints that define the tension, trace its eventual winding down, and ultimately see how it forced a rethinking of core ideas in international relations. Things like, well, the very concept of state sovereignty.
It's quite a journey. We're going from the ashes of one global conflict, World War II, to the dawn of a new kind of world order. Or maybe disorder, depending on how you look at it.
Let's set that scene then. You have to imagine Europe and really much of the world right after World War II. Utter devastation, millions dead, cities just flattened, economies shattered.
Yeah, the old powers were exhausted, Britain, France. They were victorious but weakened. And into that vacuum stepped two major powers,
Two
right,
superpowers.
with immense military and economic strength, but crucially, diametrically opposed political and economic systems, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their visions for what the post-war world should look like were just incompatible, pretty much from the start.
So how did this incompatibility first really show itself? Let's unpack the initial attempts to build some kind of post-war world order.
Okay. Right after the fighting ended, the main victorious powers, principally the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union, they gathered at two really pivotal conferences, Yalta, which was early in 1945, and then Potsdam later that summer.
And these were meant to decide the future, right? Especially for Europe.
That was the idea. And, out of Yalta came something genuinely significant, something positive amidst all the brewing tension.
The United Nations.
Exactly, the UN. It was a major outcome, born from this desire, this hope, to create a new framework for international cooperation and, well, hopefully prevent future global conflicts like the one they just endured. It was a symbol of hope.
But it was at these very same conferences, Yalta and Potsdam, that the deepest disagreements, the fundamental mistrust, really came to the surface.
Oh, absolutely.
So what were the real sticking points? What couldn't they agree on?
Well, the absolute stickiest issues debated there were the fate of Poland and the fate of Germany. These weren't just arguments about drawing lines on a map. They were about political control, about spheres of influence, and fundamentally about the future alignment of the entire European continent.
And understanding what happened in Poland and Germany, but also, as the source points out, places like Greece and Czechoslovakia. Understanding those cases is really key to seeing how quickly those post-war hopes just faded
Hmm.
and how the Cold War became entrenched, almost, institutionalized,
Mhm.
built into the system.
Precisely. Let's take Poland first. It's such a stark example of how Soviet intentions immediately clashed with Western ideals and, frankly, with wartime promises made to the Poles.
Okay, let's dive into Poland. The source reminds us it has this long, very complex history. It disappeared from the map entirely in 1795.
Yeah, partitioned by Russia, Austria, and Prussia.
And then Poles fought valiantly for independence right up until World War I.
That history is absolutely essential context. Because after World War I, Poland did regain independence and territory. Significantly, it got back West Prussia from Germany, which gave it crucial access to the sea.
Right.
And maybe even more importantly for the story, after war with Soviet Russia, the Treaty of Riga in 1921 gave Poland substantial territory in the east, pushing its borderway into what had been Russian land. And Moscow never forgot that. It left a deep scar.
So, when Germany attacked Poland in 1939, triggering World War II, Britain and France came to Poland's aid. That was the start of the war for them.
Hmm.
By the end of the war, the Germans were expelled primarily by the advancing Soviet Red Army.
Correct. And throughout the war, Poland had a recognized government in exile, based in London. These leaders fully expected, naturally, to return home and reestablish their independent government once the Germans were finally defeated.
But Stalin had very different plans.
Oh, yes. And plans that, surprisingly maybe, actually predated the war itself.
You're talking about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that infamous deal.
Exactly. The non-aggression treaty signed between Stalin's foreign minister Molotov and Hitler's Ribbentrop. Publicly, it was about non-aggression. but secretly.
Secret protocols.
Yes, secret protocols that basically carved up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Critically, it secretly granted Russia control over East Poland, precisely the territory Poland had gained in that 1921 Treaty of Riga.
Wow.
Now, Hitler later violated the pact by invading the USSR, of course, but that pre-war agreement vividly shows Stalin's long-standing territorial ambitions regarding Poland.
And after WWII, with the Red Army physically occupying Eastern Europe, Stalin was absolutely determined to fulfill those ambitions. He had the power on the ground.
His strategic calculation was, well, straightforward, if ruthless. Russia had been invaded repeatedly from the west, often through Poland. So, from his perspective, to guarantee Soviet security, Poland had to be a friendly state. It had to be securely within Moscow's sphere of influence. It couldn't be allowed to become a potential corridor for future invasions.
And he wasted absolutely no time putting this into action. The source says even before the legitimate Polish government in exile could even get back from London.
Right, before they could even pack their bags.
Russia had already set up a completely separate pro-Soviet government in Lublin, in eastern Poland, the Lublin Committee.
This presented the Western allies, Britain and France, with a terrible dilemma. The Red Army was the dominant force on the ground. They couldn't just kick Stalin's favorite government out.
No way.
But they also couldn't just abandon Poland to Soviet control, not after going to war in 1939, supposedly to protect Polish sovereignty. Their publics back home, who had just sacrificed so much, demanded they stand for democratic principles.
So their response became focused on principle.
Yes, they championed the idea of self-determination for the Polish people. This principle that nations should freely choose their own political future had been a powerful idea in the 20th century, and it was widely seen as a basis for the post-war order.
So they pushed Stalin.
They pressed him hard at Yalta and Potsdam to include democratic elements from the London government in some kind of provisional government, and crucially, to hold genuinely free and fair elections later on.
Did that pressure actually achieve anything?
Well, it allowed Britain and France to go back to their people and say, look, we fought for Polish democracy. But on the ground, Stalin was relentless. He just continued to consolidate the power of his Lublin government, ensuring that any democratic forces were sidelined or worse.
And he formally annexed those eastern territories back into the Soviet Union.
He did, taking back what was lost in 1921.
And this wasn't just seen as disappointing in the West. The source specifically says it triggered a strong reaction in the U.S.
Absolutely. This aggressive unilateral tactic by the Soviet Union, imposing its will and ideology on a nation supposedly liberated, deeply irked the USA, as the source puts it. It significantly heightened American suspicion about Stalin's real post-war intentions and really fueled fears of a wider communist expansion across Europe.
And Poland wasn't an isolated case, was it? This strategy was basically replicated elsewhere.
Exactly. The blueprint used in Poland, establish a pro-Soviet provisional government, sideline the Democrats, ensure communist control, hold rigged elections if necessary. This was applied systematically to install compliant regimes in Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and Albania.
Creating a bloc of states under Moscow's thumb.
A solid bloc under Moscow's firm political and economic control.
Which inevitably just escalated Western anxieties and hardened those lines of division across the continent.
Leading directly to Winston Churchill's landmark speech in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946. That's where he famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, stretching from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic.
Dividing the continent.
Dividing it into two distinct antagonistic spheres, the Soviet-dominated communist East and the largely democratic capitalist West.
Okay, so the conferences exposed the cracks, and Russia's actions in Eastern Europe really hammered home the division, symbolized by that phrase, the Iron Curtain. That's the stage set, the basic divide established. Now, let's look at how this divide became even more rigid, more institutionalized, through major doctrines, key crises, and the formation of opposing military and economic alliances.
Right, this next phase is absolutely critical because it shows the Western powers shifting gears. They move from sort of hoping for cooperation to actively trying to counteract Soviet influence. And a prime example of this is the situation that unfolded in Greece.
Which directly led to a really foundational U.S. policy statement.
Exactly.
Greece had been occupied by Germany until 1944. After liberation, Britain initially stepped in to help establish a monarchy.
That's right. But post-war Greece was incredibly unstable. There was a strong communist-led insurgency fighting to overthrow the newly forming monarchy. And Britain, economically shattered by the war, signaled to the U.S. that it could no longer afford to provide the necessary aid and support to the Greek government. They were pulling out.
And the U.S. saw this as a potential domino falling, a chance for the Soviets to gain ground.
Precisely. Witnessing the potential collapse of the Greek government and fearing a communist takeover there, which they assumed was Soviet-directed, President Harry Truman felt he had to act. So in March 1947, he went before Congress.
And made that famous speech.
He asserted that the United States must support free people who would resist any subjugation by outside powers, specifically referencing the threats in Greece and also neighboring Turkey.
And this principle became known as the Truman Doctrine.
It was a landmark moment, a fundamental shift. The Truman Doctrine explicitly stated that the U.S. would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian forces. And it specifically named Soviet-backed communist movements as the primary threat.
How did the Soviets take this?
Predictably, they saw the Truman Doctrine as an open declaration of the Cold War. They didn't see it as defending freedom. They saw it as aggressive American interventionism aimed squarely at undermining Soviet influence and ideology around the world.
And how did it actually play out in Greece? Did the aid work?
Well, the U.S. responded with significant financial and military aid. They pumped, as the source says, enormous amounts of money into Greece to have the government fight the insurgents and stabilize the country.
And the outcome?
The source describes this intervention as ultimately a peaceful victory for the West. Meaning, the U.S., by providing aid, helped the Greek government defeat the communist rebels and restore the monarchy without needing direct U.S. military combat against the insurgents, or, more importantly, against the Soviets. It was containment in action.
And this event marked a really profound shift in American foreign policy, didn't it?
Absolutely. The source really emphasizes this. After the Greece issue, the U.S. decisively abandoned its long-standing isolationist stance, which had, dominated its foreign policy for much of its history. It committed itself to actively engaging in international affairs, specifically with the goal of curtailing the spread of communism. No more standing on the sidelines.
And the economic counterpart to the Truman Doctrine was announced soon after, the Marshall Plan.
Announced in June 1947 by Secretary of State George Marshall. Officially, it was the European Recovery Plan. And while its humanitarian aspect was definitely real, helping war-devastated Europe rebuild was a genuine goal, its strategic aim was equally, if not more, significant.
It was seen as essential to preventing communism from taking root in those economically fragile Western European nations. People needed food and jobs.
Precisely. By providing billions of dollars in aid, the Marshall Plan helped speed up economic recovery in Western Europe, which in turn stabilized democratic governments and crucially reduced the appeal of communist parties, especially in countries like France and Italy, where they were quite strong initially. It became the economic pillar supporting the political and military goals of the Truman Doctrine.
So Greece, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, these laid down the early framework of the Western response to what they perceived as Soviet expansionism. What happened next to sort of solidify the divide even further?
Well, the Czech crisis of 1948 was another major turning point. This event was a really clear demonstration of how Soviet control could be imposed, even in a country that initially tried to maintain some degree of neutrality, some independence.
Czechoslovakia in 1946 had this kind of unique situation, right? A communist prime minister, Klement Gottwald, but alongside a respected non-communist president, Edvard Beneš. And the source mentions Beneš initially hoped Czechoslovakia could be a kind of bridge between East and West Europe.
It was a very precarious balancing act. And because Gottwald was prime minister, Czechoslovakia felt pressured by Moscow to refuse aid from the U.S. under the Marshall Plan, even though the country desperately needed economic help after the war. This refusal further alienated it from the West.
And then, in February 1948, just before elections were scheduled, things changed dramatically.
Yeah, the Communist Party, probably sensing they might not actually win a free election, undertook a swift, decisive coup. Backed by the implicit threat of Soviet intervention if needed, they used their control over the police, the media, worker militias to force the resignation of all the non-communist ministers in the government.
Leaving only communists to contest the elections in May 1948.
Exactly. The result was a foregone conclusion. A parliament totally dominated by communists, and Klement Gottwald became president. Beneš, completely disillusioned and isolated, resigned shortly after.
So that idea of Czechoslovakia being a bridge, completely gone.
Utterly extinguished. And as the source notes, this event alarmed the West profoundly. It wasn't just about losing one more country to the Soviet sphere. It demonstrated that the Soviet Union was willing to use internal political maneuvering, backed by the threat of force, to ensure communist dominance in Eastern Europe, even overturning existing democratic processes. This significantly increased Western fears about the reach and the ruthlessness of communist expansion.
Which brings us back to Germany. The most fractured point of all, perhaps the most dangerous early flashpoint. The division of Germany and Berlin, the Berlin airlift, and the direct military counter-response from the West in the form of NATO.
Right. Germany and its capital, Berlin, were, as agreed at Yalta and Potsdam, divided into 4 occupation zones. The US, UK, and France controlled zones that would eventually become West Germany. Plus, they jointly controlled the western sectors of Berlin. The Soviet Union controlled what became East Germany and also East Berlin.
And there was a stark contrast in how these zones developed, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. The western zones, benefiting from Marshall Plan aid and adopting a different economic philosophy, began to consolidate and experienced much faster economic recovery. They were rebuilding. East Germany, under Soviet control and subjected to a centralized command economy, remained mired in poverty, as the source says. It faced significant economic challenges, partly due to Soviet reparations policies as well.
This created tension, obviously, and it escalated dramatically in June 1948.
The Western powers decided to introduce a new currency, the Deutschmark, in their zones of Germany, and crucially, also in West Berlin. From their perspective, this was a necessary step for economic stability and recovery in their areas.
But West Berlin was this island, physically located deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, almost 110 kilometers from the border with West Germany.
Exactly.
Introducing a separate Western currency, there was bound to be seen as a provocation by Moscow.
It certainly was. The source notes Russia became extremely upset. They viewed it as a deliberate attempt to undermine the East German economy and assert Western economic and political influence deep within their sphere of control. Their response was drastic.
The blockade.
They ordered a total blockade of all rail, road, and canal traffic between West Berlin and West Germany, cutting it off completely.
They were trying to starve West Berlin into submission, weren't they? To force the Western powers out.
That was the clear goal. They believed this pressure would compel the US, UK, and France to abandon their sectors in West Berlin. But, as the source aptly puts it, the move backfired for Soviet in a pretty spectacular way.
Because the Western powers didn't leave, they responded with the Berlin airlift.
An absolutely astonishing logistical undertaking. Instead of conceding, Britain, France, and America organized this massive round-the-clock operation to supply West Berlin entirely by air.
Everything. By air.
Everything. Food, coal for heating and power, medicine, raw materials for factories. Everything needed to keep the city's population alive and its economy from collapsing was airdropped or landed at Berlin's airports, like Tempelhof, for nearly a year.
It must have been incredibly challenging logistically and politically.
Immense coordination, immense political will. But it worked. The airlift was successful. It kept West Berlin going and became a powerful symbol of Western resolve.
And how did the Soviets eventually respond to this unexpected success?
Finally, in May 1949, realizing the blockade had completely failed to achieve its objective and was instead turning into a massive propaganda disaster for them, Stalin lifted it. The source calls this a big blow to the USSR, as their attempt to force the West out had visibly failed. They gained nothing concrete.
And after the blockade ended, the division of Germany became permanent, didn't it? At least for the next 4 decades.
Yes. The failure of the blockade and the airlift success accelerated the formal division. The German Federal Republic, West Germany, was officially formed in May 1949 with Konrad Adenauer as its first chancellor, firmly oriented towards the West. Then in October 1949, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, was established in the Soviet zone, just as firmly aligned with Moscow.
And the Western powers, having seen the clear need for collective defense against potential Soviet aggression, which the Berlin blockade seemed to demonstrate, they solidified their military alliance.
Also in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was formed. This was a formal security alliance bringing together the major West European states, Canada, and the U.S. Its core principle was collective defense. Article 5 stated that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all.
So the Berlin crisis, coming after Greece and Czechoslovakia, really cemented the strategy of containment and mutual defense in Europe.
Absolutely. The source identifies the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the formation of NATO as the key pillars of the U.S. strategy to contain communism in Europe. It definitively ended any lingering U.S. isolationism and established the fundamental framework for the Western alliance throughout the entire Cold War.
And while these two German states were now formally established, attempts at unifying them failed for decades. Why was that?
Well, according to the source, the reasons for this failure differed on each side. For Chancellor Adenauer in West Germany, integrating the new republic securely into the Western economic and political system, aligning with the U.S. and Western European values, was actually a higher priority than immediate unification. He feared unification might compromise that vital Western integration.
And for East Germany and the Soviet Union?
Their primary concern was preventing the flow of people, especially skilled workers and professionals, from the economically struggling East to the increasingly prosperous West. This brain drain was a serious problem for East Germany.
And this concern about people leaving, this brain drain, directly led to a very physical, very symbolic barrier.
Exactly. To stop this significant emigration from East Germany, the East German government, with full backing from Moscow, began constructing the Berlin Wall in August 1961. It literally sealed the border between East and West Berlin overnight.
And that wall became, arguably, the most potent and tragic symbol of the entire institutionalized Cold War divide.
A very stark, concrete symbol of the Iron Curtain, physically dividing a city, a nation, families. It trapped people on one side. It stood as this brutal symbol of the Cold War's rigidity for nearly 30 years.
Until its dramatic fall in 1989, which finally paved the way for German unification in 1990.
A truly historic moment.
Okay, so we've charted how the Cold War became institutionalized in Europe through these doctrines, crises, alliances, and physical divisions. But the conflict wasn't just confined to Europe, was it? The source describes how containment expanded globally, particularly into Asia, and how economic and political blocs solidified on both sides worldwide.
That's absolutely right. The containment strategy the U.S. developed in Europe, this idea of preventing the spread of communism, quickly spread beyond the continent. The source specifically highlights that containment efforts expanded to places like Korea and Vietnam and Asia. These became major and very bloody theaters of Cold War conflict, proxy wars, essentially.
And back in Western Europe, while NATO solidified the military alliance, there was also this significant push towards economic integration, which you mentioned was spurred by the Marshall Plan aid.
This was a really remarkable development, especially given the history of conflict in Europe. The process began with very practical steps. The source mentions the European Coal and Steel Company, established in 1951. It involved France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries. Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg.
Pooling coal and steel, why those?
Because those were the essential resources needed to wage war. The idea, championed by figures like Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, was to place control over these vital industries under a supranational authority, making war between France and Germany, historical rivals, materially impossible, as Schuman put it.
And this initiative grew into something much bigger.
Exactly. This was the seed. It evolved into the European Economic Community, or EC, formally established by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. The EEC aimed at creating a common market, removing trade barriers, and fostering much deeper economic ties. This contributed significantly to Western Europe's post-war prosperity and political stability.
Now, this integration was happening under the broad umbrella of the Western Alliance, led largely by the U.S., but the source mentions Charles de Gaulle in France as a kind of manifestation of a new nationalism within this bloc. He wasn't just going along with everything the U.S. wanted.
Not at all. De Gaulle, who returned to power in France in 1958, had a very distinct vision for Europe and for France's role in it. He didn't want a Europe dominated by the Anglo-Saxons of the U.S. and Britain. He envisioned a strong Europe of nations based on an association of equally strong independent nation-states, with France naturally playing a leading role.
And he wasn't afraid to challenge American dominance within NATO itself.
Definitely not. The source notes specific actions. He refused to allow NATO to install a nuclear weapons shield on French territory. He pulled France out of NATO's integrated military command structure in 1966, although France remained part of the political alliance. He refused to sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, insisting on developing France's own independent nuclear deterrent, the force de frappe.
He also worked closely with West Germany.
Yes, he strengthened Franco-German ties. seeing that partnership as a core element that could balance Anglo-American influence within Europe.
So this Gaullism, as the source defines it, this sort of nationalist, somewhat elitist approach emphasizing conservatism, national pride, a strong state centralized government, it was really about asserting French independence and keeping American and British dominance under check within the Western alliance itself.
Pretty much. It represented a desire for France to pursue its own independent foreign policy, charting its own course, even while remaining broadly aligned with the West against the Soviet threat. He even, quite boldly for the time, tried to establish diplomatic relations with Communist China in 1964, long before the U.S. made its opening to China.
Okay, so the West is integrating economically, creating the EEC, albeit with these internal nationalist variations like Gaullism. How did Russia and the Eastern Bloc respond to this Western integration, and specifically to the Marshall Plan?
Well, Russia initially denounced the Marshall Plan quite strongly, calling it dollar imperialism. They saw it as a U.S. tool for economic penetration and political control over Western Europe. So naturally, they needed their own structures to manage and integrate their Eastern European satellite states.
And they created counterparts to the Western initiatives, didn't they? Mirror images, almost.
Yes, they did. In 1947, they established the Cominform, the Communist Information Bureau. This wasn't primarily economic. It was more of a political and ideological mechanism to ensure conformity and tighten Moscow's political grip on the satellite states. It coordinated the activities of communist parties across the bloc and pushed policies like rapid, state-led industrialization, forced collectivization of agriculture, and centralized economic planning, all dictated from Moscow.
And for economic integration, what was their answer to the Marshall Plan and the EEC?
Also, starting around 1947, the Molotov Plan was announced. This eventually evolved into the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, formally established in 1949. This was the Soviet answer to the Marshall Plan and the EEC. It aimed to integrate the economies of the Eastern Bloc states, coordinating trade and production. But unlike the EEC's market-based approach, Comecon operated under strict Soviet direction, prioritizing Moscow's strategic and economic goals. It wasn't really a partnership of equals.
So they mirrored the West's structures, political coordination, economic integration, but with a very clear focus on central control and ideological alignment dictated by Moscow.
Exactly. And the global picture, the whole scope of the Cold War, shifted dramatically with the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Mao Zedong's communists took power.
A huge country turning communist.
A massive shift. And when China concluded a treaty of alliance with the Soviet Union in 1950, the perceived threat of monolithic communism seemed to expand eastward significantly.
This spread into Asia, the source says, made the U.S. look east as well. They couldn't just focus on Europe anymore.
Absolutely. The strategic map changed fundamentally. This expanding sphere of communist influence in Asia, now including China, compelled Russia to further consolidate its military alliances. In 1955, they created the Warsaw Pact,
The direct counterpart to NATO.
explicitly structured on the lines of the NATO, as the source puts it. It was a collective defense treaty binding the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellite states, East Germany joined later, into a unified military command under Moscow's control.
So NATO in the West, Warsaw Pact in the East. The military blocs were now firmly established, defining the geopolitical landscape for decades.
The lines were drawn.
And speaking of looking east, the source highlights another crucial development, the U.S. forging an alliance with Japan.
Right. This was a remarkable turnaround. Japan had been utterly devastated by the U.S. during World War II, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the geopolitical shifts between 1947 and 1950, Soviet consolidation in Eastern Europe, China turning communist, the Sino-Soviet Treaty, and then the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, these events fundamentally changed the U.S. perspective on Japan.
Japan went from being this defeated enemy to a crucial potential ally in the fight against communism.
Precisely. The U.S. came to see Japan as indispensable. They desperately needed a stable, strategically located base in East Asia for operations aimed at containing communism in the region. Japan, an island nation off the coast of China and close to Korea and the Soviet Far East, was ideally positioned for this role.
And the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951 formally cemented this new relationship.
Yes. This peace treaty officially ended the Allied occupation of Japan, but it was signed alongside a bilateral security treaty between the U.S. and Japan. So Japan regained its sovereignty and, crucially, received tremendous economic support from the U.S., which fueled its rapid post-war economic miracle.
And in return?
In return, the U.S. secured long-term rights to maintain military bases in Japan. These bases provided that crucial platform for projecting American power and pursuing containment in the Pacific region throughout the Cold War. Japan became a cornerstone of U.S. strategy in Asia.
So Japan became this vital anchor for the U.S. containment strategy in Asia, and that strategy was almost immediately put to a major test by a crisis on the nearby Korean peninsula.
Korea had been a Japanese colony since 1910. As Japan faced defeat in WWII, Russia and the USA agreed somewhat hastily to temporarily divide Korea at the 38th parallel. This was mainly for administrative convenience regarding the surrender of Japanese forces. The Soviets would accept the surrender north of the line, the Americans south of it.
But the plan was supposedly for a unified, independent Korea eventually, right? Not permanent division.
That was the stated intention. The UN called for free and fair elections to be held throughout Korea with the aim of establishing a single unified government. The U.S. was initially confident that the South, which contained about two-thirds of the peninsula's population, would vote against communism. However, cooperation between the occupying powers broke down completely, making peninsula-wide elections impossible.
So instead of unified elections, separate states emerged in the North and South.
Yes, two distinct governments formed, each claiming legitimacy over the entire peninsula. In the South, the U.S. backed the Republic of Korea, led by Syngman Rhee. In the North, the Soviet Union backed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, led by Kim Il-sung. Tensions simmered constantly along the 38th parallel dividing line.
And in June 1950, those tensions just exploded.
The North Korean army, with backing and supplies from the USSR and newly communist China, launched a full-scale invasion of the South. They rapidly overwhelmed the South Korean forces and pushed deep into the peninsula.
And how did the U.S. interpret this invasion? What was their reaction?
The U.S. saw this as a clear, deliberate attempt by the communist bloc directed by Moscow, they believed, to spread its influence by force. They viewed it specifically as a repetition of the events happened in Korea, meaning a parallel to how they saw communist attempts to take over in places like Greece or Czechoslovakia. This reinforced their commitment to containment, absolutely.
So they intervened militarily?
Yes. President Truman quickly committed U.S. forces, framing the intervention as a UN police action to repel the aggression, although the U.S. provided the vast majority of the UN forces.
The Korean War then became a major proxy conflict of the Cold War, didn't it?
It absolutely did. It became a brutal three-year war. It involved U.S.-led UN forces fighting against North Korean forces, and later, massive numbers of Chinese volunteer forces who intervened when UN troops pushed close to the Chinese border. The Soviet Union provided crucial logistical support, equipment, and air power. Those Soviet pilots often flew in planes with North Korean markings.
A real international conflict fought on Korean soil.
Immense bloodshed, millions dead, terrible destruction. After initial advances and retreats by both sides, the war settled into a protracted stalemate, roughly along the original 38th parallel.
How did it end?
Eventually, a ceasefire agreement was signed in July 1953. It didn't officially end the war technically. North and South Korea are still at war today, but it stopped the fighting. The 38th parallel was largely reasserted as the line of demarcation, solidifying the division of Korea that persists to this day.
But the war had a lasting impact on U.S. policy and global strategy.
It certainly did. By this point, the source notes, the U.S. had unequivocally realized the need to contain communism, not just in Europe, but globally. The Korean War seemed to confirm that containment might require direct military intervention, not just economic or political aid. It led to a massive increase in U.S. defense spending and a further expansion of its global commitments.
And after Korea, the U.S. continued to build this network of alliances beyond Europe and Japan.
Yes, the strategy extended into creating a kind of cordon sanitaire, a ring of alliances around the perceived periphery of the Soviet Union and China. The U.S. formed multiple bilateral and multilateral alliances with states across Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East.
Like SEATO and CENTO. Exactly. This included the formation of SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization, which grew out of the earlier Baghdad Pact. The source specifically highlights SEATO's focus on incorporating Pakistan. Pakistan was seen as strategically vital for containing communism in South Asia, partly because of its location bordering Afghanistan and Iran, and also potentially acting as a counterweight to India, which pursued a policy of non-alignment.
Okay, so by the mid-1950s, the Cold War map was pretty much drawn globally. You had these two massive military and economic blocs facing off, anchored by intricate webs of alliances and containment strategies developed from these early crises in Europe and Asia. But then the source talks about a potential easing of tensions, a period that came to be known as détente, linked to a major change in Soviet leadership. That's right, a really significant turning point. potentially, arrived in 1953 with the death of Joseph Stalin. He had been this absolute authoritarian figure dominating the Soviet Union and the communist world. His successor, after a period of collective leadership, was Nikita Khrushchev, who brought a markedly different style and approach to the Soviet leadership.
How did Khrushchev's approach differ from Stalin's?
Well, Khrushchev emerged first as first secretary of the Communist Party and later also as chairman of the Council of Ministers, consolidating his power. While he was absolutely still a firm believer in communism, he belonged to a group within the leadership that recognized that the extreme repression, the purges, and the intense international isolation under Stalin had been frankly counterproductive and damaging to the Soviet Union itself.
And the source notes that perhaps coincidentally in the U.S., the administration under President Eisenhower who succeeded Truman was also signaling a potential willingness to engage, cautiously moving away from the most rigid aspects of early Cold War policy. They were also processing the implications of Stalin's death.
Right. There was maybe a mutual, tentative exploration of whether things could change. Khrushchev's prime intention, according to the source, was genuinely to try and relax the strained relationships between U.S. and USSR and create a more conducive environment for talks. He understood, especially with both sides now possessing hydrogen bombs, that perpetual high-tension confrontation was incredibly dangerous and perhaps unsustainable.
And he actively promoted this idea of peaceful coexistence. What did that mean in practice?
It was a key concept for Khrushchev. He began to diplomatically assert that peaceful coexistence with the capitalist West was a real possibility. Now, this didn't mean abandoning the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, not at all.
So competition would continue.
Yes, but the idea was that the competition should be waged through economic, political, and ideological means, rather than through direct military conflict. Let the best system prove itself, essentially. He also worked to ease some of the most brutal aspects of control over the Eastern European satellite states. His famous secret speech denouncing Stalin's crimes in 1956 was part of this, though he certainly wasn't prepared to let them break free entirely, as the Hungarian uprising later showed.
And this period of détente, this thaw, saw some notable moments where tensions genuinely seemed to reduce.
It did. The idea of peaceful coexistence seemed to bear some fruit. Khrushchev made a historic visit to the United States in 1959, the first Soviet leader ever to do so. He toured the country, famously debated Vice President Nixon in a model American kitchen.
The kitchen debate.
Exactly. And he had direct talks with President Eisenhower at Camp David. They even discussed the incredibly sensitive issue of disarmament. This kind of direct engagement was a world away from the deep freeze and constant brinkmanship of the early Cold War years under Stalin.
That sounds genuinely promising, a real shift. But the source immediately notes that even while this political relaxation was being observed, the underlying arms race continued unabated.
And the dangers inherent in that arms race quickly brought tensions snapping back. The U.S., having formed NATO and seeing the Soviet Union developing its own nuclear capabilities, continued to deploy nuclear-capable missiles close to the Soviet Union's borders. The source specifically mentions the U.S. installing Jupiter and Thor intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Turkey, a NATO ally right on the USSR's southern border.
Which must have been seen as a major threat by Moscow.
Absolutely. It aggravated Russia immensely. They saw these missiles, capable of hitting Soviet cities in minutes, as a direct first-strike strategic threat right on their doorstep.
So this underlying mistrust, this strategic competition, meant that détente was incredibly fragile.
Extremely fragile. And it almost ended completely, as the source says, in May 1960. That's when the Soviets shot down a high-altitude American U-2 spy plane flying deep over Soviet territory.
The U-2 incident.
Right. The U.S. initially denied it was a spy mission, claiming it was a weather plane that had strayed off course. But the Soviets produced not only the wreckage, but also the captured pilot, Francis Gary Powers. It was undeniable proof of U.S. espionage. This incident severely damaged the fragile trust that had been building and led Khrushchev to cancel a planned four-power summit in Paris.
So the brief period of potential warmth just evaporated almost overnight.
Pretty much. The goodwill, such as it was, dissipated rapidly. And this U-2 crisis was followed almost immediately by two of the most intense, most dangerous crises of the entire Cold War. These brought the conflict back in full force, as the source describes it. We're talking about the escalating U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Let's look at these two critical cases then, as they really highlight the global reach and the terrifying stakes of the Cold War. First, Southeast Asia, specifically the crisis in Indochina and the U.S.-Vietnam War. The source reminds us Indochina comprised Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, which had all been under French colonial rule before WWII.
That's right. And after WWII, France tried to reassert its control, but faced a powerful nationalist and communist-led independence movement in Vietnam, headed by Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh forces. This led to the First Indochina War, fought between 1946 and 1954.
Which ended with a decisive French defeat.
A stunning defeat for a major European power at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This forced France to the negotiating table.
Which led to the Geneva Conference later that year, aimed at settling the future of Indochina.
Exactly. The Geneva Accords of 1954 granted independence to Laos and Cambodia. For Vietnam, however, the solution was more complicated. The Accords temporarily divided Vietnam into two zones at the 17th parallel. Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh controlled the north, establishing a communist government based in Hanoi.
And what about the South and unification?
The Accords called for national elections to be held in 1956 to unify the entire country under a single government.
But those crucial 1956 elections never actually happened. Why not?
Well, the United States was deeply involved by this point, having supported the French effort financially. And the U.S. was not happy, as the source puts it, with the prospect of a unified Vietnam, potentially led by Ho Chi Minh.
Because Ho Chi Minh had communist ties, particularly Russian influence, according to the source, though China was also a major backer.
Right. But perhaps more importantly, the U.S. feared that given Ho Chi Minh's widespread popularity as a nationalist leader who had defeated the French, he would almost certainly win a free election decisively. This would mean a communist victory for the entire country.
And the U.S. interpreted this potential outcome through the lens of containment and the domino theory, which was gaining currency in Washington.
Exactly. They saw the potential unification under communism, not just as a loss in Vietnam, but as a repetition of the events happened in Korea, another instance of communism expanding by political means, if not military force. And they feared that if Vietnam fell, other Southeast Asian nations, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, maybe even further afield, would follow like dominoes.
So, in South Vietnam, instead of pushing for the Geneva Accords call for nationwide elections, the U.S. backed the creation of a separate anti-communist state.
Yes, the U.S. threw its support behind Nguyen Ngo Dinh Diem, an anti-communist nationalist. Diem established the Republic of Vietnam in the south, with Saigon as its capital. The source notes Diem was installed through a referendum held only in the South, not the nationwide election envisaged by the Geneva Conference. And his rule quickly became autocratic and, as the source says, extremely brutal.
He was deeply unpopular, wasn't he? Particularly with the Buddhist majority in the South, who resented his favoritism towards Catholics and desired social and land reforms.
Yes, Diem suppressed political opposition ruthlessly and crushed demands for reform. This created widespread discontent and ultimately led to a situation of growing civil war within South Vietnam itself, as various groups opposed to Diem's rule began to emerge and resist.
And how did the U.S. interpret this internal conflict that was brewing in the South?
Crucially, the U.S. leadership largely envisaged the Civil War as being instigated by North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. While it's true that North Vietnam did provide support and direction to the insurgency in the South, the conflict also had very deep roots in genuine popular resistance to Diem's repressive and corrupt regime. It wasn't just an external imposition.
This internal resistance eventually coalesced into the National Liberation Front, NLF, and its military arm became famous for its guerrilla tactics, known as the Viet Cong.
Fearing that the NLF and Viet Cong were simply puppets of North Vietnam and ultimately instruments of Moscow and Beijing, the U.S. steadily increased its economic and military aid to Diem's increasingly unstable government throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s.
But aid wasn't enough. Diem was overthrown and killed in a U.S.-backed coup in 1963, leading to even more instability.
Right. And as the situation deteriorated, the U.S. became directly involved militarily. Initially through sending military advisors, but then escalating significantly after the controversial Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, the U.S. committed hundreds of thousands of ground troops and launched a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam.
But despite deploying immense military power, the U.S. found itself bogged down in a protracted and costly war.
They faced incredibly determined guerrilla warfare from the Viet Cong in the jungles and villages of the South, and resilient resistance from the North Vietnamese Regular Army, who were effectively supplied by the Soviet Union and China. The source states bluntly, Nothing worked in U.S. favor in terms of achieving a quick victory. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched severe counteroffensives like the Tet Offensive in 1968, which inflicted heavy casualties and dramatically eroded American public support for the war back home.
Sensing a military stalemate and facing mounting political pressure, the U.S. began to look for a way out.
In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson announced a halt to most of the bombing of North Vietnam and initiated peace talks in Paris. The difficult diplomatic engagement continued under his successor, President Richard Nixon, alongside a policy of Vietnamization, trying to hand the fighting over to South Vietnamese forces. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, formally ending direct U.S. military involvement.
But the war didn't end there for the Vietnamese.
No. Without direct U.S. combat support, the South Vietnamese government couldn't withstand the pressure from the North and the Viet Cong. Saigon fell in April 1975, and the country was finally unified under communist rule.
And what was the crucial lesson or mistake the source highlights from this incredibly costly and divisive conflict?
A major takeaway emphasized in the source is that the U.S. made a crucial mistake in confusing Vietnam's nationalism with communism. Many Vietnamese fighting against the French and later against the Americans and the Saigon government were driven primarily by powerful nationalist desires for independence, unity, and self-determination after decades of colonial rule. While communism provided an ideology and organizational structure, it was deeply intertwined with nationalism. The U.S. tended to view this complex local struggle primarily through the rigid global lens of the Cold War, seeing Ho Chi Minh simply as a pawn of Moscow or Beijing, which led to devastating consequences.
A profoundly difficult and impactful crisis indeed. And the other event that the source says brought the Cold War back in full force was the Cuban Missile Crisis, arguably the single moment the world came closest to nuclear annihilation.
It's certainly considered that way. And the situation in Cuba had a long history, deeply intertwined with U.S. interests and influence. Cuba had been effectively under American political and economic control or significant influence since the Spanish-American War back in 1898. It was often ruled by figures friendly to U.S. interests.
Like Fulgencio Batista, who was in power at the start of the Cold War.
Exactly. The U.S. backed Batista, but he was a dictator who was, as the source notes, gradually growing unpopular due to corruption and repression.
And the U.S. had major economic interests there, didn't they?
Oh, extensive interests. The source says many American businesses flourished in Cuba. They owned vast tracts of land, profitable sugar plantations, utilities, hotels, casinos. Cuba was, in many ways, an American economic playground.
And this whole setup was challenged dramatically by Fidel Castro and his revolution.
Castro, a charismatic lawyer and revolutionary, capitalized on Batista's weakening, corrupt rule. He initially launched an unsuccessful attack on the Moncada Army barracks on July 26, 1953, a date still celebrated in Cuba for which he was imprisoned. Later, after being released, he went into exile, then returned to lead a guerrilla campaign. Batista's regime eventually crumbled due to its own internal weaknesses, financial bankruptcy, and loss of popular and military support, creating a power vacuum. Castro's revolutionary movement filled this vacuum, taking power relatively quickly in January 1959. While there was fighting, it wasn't a protracted civil war during the final transition period. Batista fled.
As Castro consolidated his power, he started taking actions that directly challenged those extensive U.S. interests.
A key move, and a very controversial one, was the nationalization of property owned by U.S. business houses and wealthy Cubans. He seized sugar plantations, factories, utilities. From Castro's perspective, and as the source mentions, he justified this using the powerful logic of sovereignty and nationalism, asserting Cuba's right as a sovereign nation to control its own resources and economy, free from foreign domination.
How did the United States react to having its economic interests seized like that?
The U.S. retaliated swiftly and forcefully, both economically and politically. A major blow was closing the lucrative U.S. market to sugarcane imports from Cuba, which was the backbone of the Cuban economy. This severely damaged Cuba's financial situation. The U.S. also imposed other economic sanctions and broke off diplomatic relations.
And this economic pressure had a significant impact on ordinary Cubans.
Yes, a lot of Cubans were affected by the economic downturn and the political changes. Some, particularly those whose property was nationalized, or who opposed Castro's increasingly authoritarian rule, began leaving the island primarily for the U.S., settling in places like Florida. This created a vocal anti-Castro exile community.
Faced with intense U.S. economic pressure and open hostility, Castro looked elsewhere for support.
Domestically, he used the U.S. actions to fuel nationalism and rally support against perceived American imperialism. Internationally, he turned to the other superpower. He requested help from Russia, seeking an alliance, economic aid, and crucially, protection from potential U.S. military intervention, which seemed increasingly likely.
And this growing alignment between Cuba and the Soviet Union led President Kennedy, who took office in 1961, to perceive Castro's Cuba as a serious Cuban menace right on America's doorstep. He tasked the CIA with finding a solution.
The CIA came up with the Bay of Pigs plan later that year, in April 1961. The idea was to train and arm about 1,400 Cuban exiles living in Florida and secretly land them on Cuban beaches at the Bay of Pigs.
What was the goal? What were they supposed to achieve?
The fundamentally flawed assumption behind the plan was that these exiles would act as a catalyst, linking up with supposedly widespread discontent among Cubans on the island and triggering a general popular uprising against Castro.
But that assumption was completely wrong, wasn't it?
Utterly wrong. The CIA seriously misjudged the level of popular support Castro actually enjoyed at that time, especially after his nationalist defiance of the U.S. The invasion was a complete disaster. The exile brigade was quickly isolated and pinned down on the beaches by Castro's forces. The source notes starkly, within a span of 3 days, the local Cubans overpowered them.
Did the exiles request help from the U.S.?
They desperately requested air support and reinforcements from the CIA and the U.S. military. But President Kennedy, wary of direct U.S. military involvement becoming public, decided against providing overt support. The U.S. was not prepared for something like this, as the source puts it, meaning they weren't prepared for the plan to fail so quickly and decisively, requiring a major U.S. intervention to salvage it. The exiles were captured or killed. It was a huge embarrassment for the Kennedy administration.
And Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev observed this U.S. failure, this botched attempt to overthrow Castro in Cuba.
He did, and according to the source, observing this failure, Khrushchev made an incredibly bold and incredibly risky decision. He decided to secretly deploy Soviet medium-range and intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Cuba.
Missiles capable of hitting major cities across the United States within minutes.
Exactly. From Khrushchev's strategic perspective, this move served multiple purposes. First, it would provide a powerful deterrent against any future U.S. military invasion of Cuba, protecting his new ally. Second, it would dramatically shift the strategic nuclear balance by establishing a Soviet missile presence on an island proximate enough to launch devastating attacks on the U.S. East Coast with little warning time.
And the source also suggests another motivation.
Yes, the source interprets that the Russian aim seems to have been to teach the U.S. how it feels to have missiles near them. It was likely, at least in part, a direct response to the U.S. having deployed those Jupiter and Thor missiles right on the Soviet border in Turkey. Turnabout is fair play, perhaps, in the deadly game of nuclear chess.
And then, in October 1962, the CIA discovered photographic evidence from U-2 spy planes showing these missile sites being constructed in Cuba.
This discovery triggered the most dangerous 13 days of the Cold War, possibly in all of human history. President Kennedy and his advisors debated frantically how to respond. Options ranged from diplomacy to airstrikes to a full-scale invasion of Cuba.
What did they decide?
Kennedy chose a middle course. He announced the discovery of the missiles to the world and ordered a naval quarantine, essentially a blockade, though they avoided that specific word around Cuba to prevent any more Soviet ships carrying offensive weapons from reaching the island. U.S. warships began stopping and searching incoming Russian ships. The U.S. military went on high alert worldwide.
This was the moment the world truly held its breath, fearing the outbreak of nuclear war between the superpowers.
Tensions were unbelievably high. Soviet ships carrying missile components were sailing towards the U.S. blockade line. A U.S. spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Miscalculations or accidents could have easily triggered catastrophe. Intense, secret negotiations took place between Washington and Moscow. Ultimately, a diplomatic resolution was hammered out.
How was it resolved? Who blinked?
It's often portrayed as Khrushchev blinking, but it was more complex. Russia backed out, as the source says. Khrushchev publicly agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba under UN supervision.
And what did the U.S. give in return?
Publicly, the U.S. pledged not to invade Cuba. But crucially, as the source notes, there was a secret part of the deal. The U.S. privately agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date, removing the very threat that had likely motivated Khrushchev in the first place.
So both sides actually made significant concessions to avoid war.
Yes, and both the U.S. and Soviet leaders had a stark, terrifying realization from this near-death experience. They saw how quickly a small issue like Cuba could have escalated conflicts to the level of potential global nuclear annihilation. The crisis forced a much more sober assessment on both sides of the extreme dangers of direct confrontation in the nuclear age.
And the shared realization, the shock, actually led to some concrete steps towards reducing the risk of nuclear war.
Yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis is often cited as a major catalyst for renewed efforts towards disarmament and arms control. The source specifically points to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct communication link to prevent misunderstandings during future crises, and the signing of the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty.
Which banned nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater.
Exactly. It was a significant first step aimed at slowing the arms race and reducing radioactive fallout. Though, as the source notes, Charles de Gaulle's France, determined to build its own independent nuclear capability, refused to sign it.
So these two incredibly intense crises, the long grinding war in Vietnam and the sudden terrifying brinkmanship over Cuba, taught some very hard lessons on both sides.
According to the source, the costly failure in Vietnam eventually convinced the U.S. to explore non-military solutions more seriously and perhaps reassess its sometimes simplistic understanding of local conflicts around the world. At the same time, Russia also seemed to realize that the sheer economic cost and existential risk of the arms race was not leaving them anywhere truly beneficial compared to the immense danger it posed.
Did this lead to a more stable return to détente after these crises?
Broadly speaking, yes, for a period. While deep mistrust and competition remained, the period after Cuba and during the later stages and aftermath of Vietnam saw continued efforts towards managing the relationship and controlling the arms race. Under Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev, who led the USSR from the mid-1960s until 1982, agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I and SALT II, were negotiated with the U.S.
So Brezhnev continued Khrushchev's policy of détente.
The source says Brezhnev broadly continued the détente of Khrushchev, in the sense of maintaining communication channels and seeking agreements to manage the nuclear competition. However, this period of détente under Brezhnev was complicated and ultimately undermined by his own very different doctrine regarding the Eastern European satellites.
Right, the Brezhnev doctrine. That doesn't exactly sound like an easing of control within the Soviet bloc.
It was the opposite. The Brezhnev doctrine, which was formalized in the aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, which we'll get to, asserted the Soviet Union's right, indeed its duty, to intervene militarily in any Warsaw Pact country if Moscow deemed that socialist rule was threatened, either by internal counter-revolution or external forces.
So détente with the West, trying to manage the superpower relationship, but simultaneously asserting absolute control over the Eastern Bloc, using force if necessary.
Exactly. It was justified on the grounds of national interests, meaning the interests of the entire socialist community, as defined by Moscow, and the need to maintain the integrity and security of the Soviet sphere.
And this period of détente, fragile as it was, eventually received a major setback, didn't it?
It did. A decisive blow came with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, undertaken to prop up a failing pro-Soviet regime there.
That invasion is often seen as the event that really ended the period of détente.
It is widely viewed that way. It severely strained U.S.-Soviet relations, led the U.S. to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and ramp up support for the anti-Soviet Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. According to the source, this invasion led to the Second Cold War again, ushering in a period of renewed antagonism, heightened rhetoric, and significantly increased military spending, particularly under President Ronald Reagan in the U.S. during the 1980s.
Which brings us finally to the final act, the somewhat unexpected end of the Cold War itself. The source attributes the beginning of the end, in large part, to the reforms initiated by the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in 1985, following the relatively stagnant Brezhnev era and the short tenures of his immediate successors, Andropov and Chernenko. Gorbachev represented a new generation. He belonged to a group of reformists within the Communist Party who recognized the deep-seated systemic problems plaguing the Soviet Union.
What was his diagnosis of the USSR's core problems? Why did he think reform was necessary?
He understood, perhaps more clearly than his predecessors, that the Soviet system, as it existed, characterized by a continuous closed economy that was centrally planned and inefficient, coupled with a suppressive regime over satellite states, that bred resentment was fundamentally unsustainable. It was leading to economic stagnation, technological backwardness compared to the West, and ultimately restricted growth and declining living standards.
So his goal was reform, to fix the system, not necessarily to dismantle communism entirely.
Precisely, at least initially. His stated goal was not to abandon communism, but to revitalize it. He aimed to create a communist state with a more democratic and human face, making the system more efficient, more innovative, more responsive to people's needs, and ultimately stronger.
And he introduced two famous revolutionary policies to try and achieve this: Glasnost and Perestroika. Let's unpack those.
Glasnost literally means openness. This was a truly revolutionary policy in the context of the Soviet Union's history of censorship and repression. It allowed an unprecedented level of freedom of the press and expression. It permitted criticism of government actions and past mistakes, things that had been strictly prohibited, often brutally suppressed, since Stalin's era.
So it gave people a voice.
It gave citizens a much-needed vent to speak out, as the source says. It aimed to encourage an open society, greater transparency, and more public participation in discussing the country's problems.
And Perestroika, what was that focused on?
Perestroika means restructuring. This was focused on economic reforms. It involved attempts to decentralize the rigid, centrally planned Soviet economy. Gorbachev introduced elements of market mechanisms, allowed more autonomy for state-owned enterprises, encouraged the formation of cooperatives, and even permitted limited private enterprise. The goal was to stimulate innovation and productivity.
These sound like incredibly significant reforms, but the source describes them as being implemented step by step and slow.
They were gradual, perhaps inevitably so given the inertia of the Soviet system, but their effects, intended and unintended, were absolutely far-reaching and ultimately proved profoundly destabilizing for the rigid structures of the Soviet state and its empire.
How so? What were the impacts?
Well, Glasnost, the openness policy, had a tremendous response, especially in the satellite states of Eastern Europe. It validated decades of suppressed grievances and gave powerful voice to long-held desires for greater autonomy, national identity, and even outright independence from Moscow. It unleashed forces Gorbachev couldn't fully control.
And what about the economic impact of Perestroika? Did it work?
Perestroika's economic reforms turned out to be very complex and often poorly implemented. They tended to disrupt the old, inefficient system without immediately creating a functioning new one. This led to widespread shortages of goods, rising inflation, economic uncertainty, and growing disenchantment against the government among the Soviet population itself. People's lives didn't immediately improve. In some ways, they got harder.
So you had these internal economic problems getting worse, combined with this new political openness, allowing people to complain about it, and also allowing nationalist sentiments to resurface.
Exactly, a potent combination. The satellite states, witnessing what they perceived as weak central control from Moscow under Gorbachev's less interventionist approach — he implicitly rejected the Brezhnev doctrine of intervention — saw a historic opportunity. They began to assert independence much more forcefully, often using the new channels opened up by Glasnost independent media, political movements as a medium for protest and dissent against their local communist regimes and Soviet domination.
And this dynamic led quite rapidly to the collapse of the entire system.
The communist model, unable to reform itself successfully from within and facing widespread popular discontent both inside the USSR and across Eastern Europe, began to unravel with astonishing speed in 1989 and 1990. This culminated in a failed, hardline coup attempt against Gorbachev in August 1991, which ironically accelerated the end. Power effectively transferred in Russia from Gorbachev to Boris Yeltsin, the popularly elected president of the Russian Republic. Yeltsin then banned the Communist Party in Russia, and the source notes this marked an end to communism in Russia itself. Following this, the 15 constituent republics of the Soviet Union declared their full independence, formally dissolving the USSR by the end of 1991.
It's incredible how quickly it happened. Let's look at some specific examples the source provides of how these satellite states broke free during this period. Poland, for instance. We discussed its difficult history under Soviet control since Stalin. How did it transition under figures like Lech Walesa?
Poland had always been a restive satellite, with major worker protests in 1956, 1970, and 1976. As the source notes, Stalin was an authoritarian leader who allowed no liberty, and had even imprisoned the Polish communist leader Władysław Gomulka in the late 1940s for perceived nationalist deviations, specifically for showing some sympathy for Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav leader.
Tito famously broke with Stalin, right? And established his own form of communism.
Yes, Tito pursued an independent, non-aligned path, refusing to bow to Moscow's dictates. Stalin denounced him but didn't intervene militarily, partly because Tito had strong popular support and his own army in Yugoslavia. Interestingly, Khrushchev later tried to mend fences with Tito, visiting Yugoslavia and encouraging Tito's model, which, the source notes, created a severe dent in USSR and China relations, as China saw this as revisionism.
So how did Khrushchev handle Poland back in 1956 when there was unrest there, too?
Amidst major worker protests in Poznan in 1956, Khrushchev took a calculated risk. He released Gomulka from prison and allowed him to return to power in Poland. He permitted Gomulka a degree of liberal rule, more autonomy than other satellite leaders, recognizing Gomulka had genuine popular support. However, this autonomy had clear limits. Gomulka had to guarantee Poland's loyalty to the Warsaw Pact and respect Russia's ultimate control over Poland's foreign policy.
Fast forward to the 1980s. Poland is facing severe economic problems under General Wojciech Jaruzelski.
Yes, Jaruzelski, who imposed martial law in 1981 partly to crush the growing Solidarity movement, attempted economic reforms but largely failed. This widespread economic failure fueled the resurgence of Solidarity, which had started as an independent trade union at the Gansk shipyards under the charismatic leadership of Lech Walesa. It grew into a massive social movement, organizing strikes and demanding political and economic change.
And as Soviet control weakened under Gorbachev, Solidarity transformed from a band union into a powerful political force.
Exactly. In 1989, facing immense internal pressure, nationwide strikes, and realizing Moscow under Gorbachev wouldn't intervene militarily as it might have done before, Jaruzelski's government entered into roundtable talks with Solidarity. These talks led to semi-free elections in June 1989. Solidarity won a landslide victory in the contested seats, and Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a Solidarity advisor, became the first non-communist prime minister in the Soviet bloc since the 1940s.
And the final step to full independence.
Poland moved rapidly towards full democracy. In December 1990, fully free presidential elections were held. Lech Walesa, the icon of the Solidarity movement, was elected president, completing Poland's remarkable transition from communist rule to a fully independent democratic state.
Another key case study is Hungary. It also went from strict Soviet rule after the 1956 uprising to a democratic transition led by figures like Josef Antall Jr.
Hungary also experienced very tumultuous times under Soviet influence. Under Stalin, there was repression, leadership purges. The source mentions Stalin imprisoned Janos Kadar and installed the hardliner Rákosi. Khrushchev initially replaced Rákosi with Imre Nagy, a reformer associated with a new course. However, Rákosi continued to interfere from behind the scenes and eventually managed to regain influence, contributing to Nagy's downfall before the 1956 uprising.
And Nagy's fate during that uprising was a very harsh warning to other potential reformers in the bloc.
It absolutely was. During the spontaneous Hungarian uprising in October 1956, Imre Nagy became the figurehead. He attempted significant reforms, responding to popular demands, including announcing Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and declaring neutrality. This was completely unacceptable to Moscow.
So the Soviets intervened militarily?
Yes, the Soviet Union brutally suppressed the Hungarian uprising with tanks and troops. Nagy was arrested, deported, and later secretly tried and executed in 1958. This sent a chilling message across Eastern Europe about the absolute limits of liberalization permitted under Soviet rule at that time.
Janos Kadar was then brought back into power after the uprising was crushed.
Yes, Kadar, who had initially sided with Nagy but then switched allegiance to the Soviets during the invasion, was released from prison earlier and was installed as the new leader after the uprising. He ruled Hungary for over 3 decades, until 1988. He implemented some cautious economic reforms, sometimes called goulash communism, which allowed a slightly higher standard of living than in some other bloc countries. But his government eventually lost its grip on the economy in the late 1980s, facing mounting debt and stagnation.
Leading to a transition similar to Poland's, driven by economic problems and the changing climate under Gorbachev.
By 1989-1990, with the winds of change blowing across Eastern Europe and Kadar removed from power, political change became inevitable in Hungary too. Multi-party politics were revived. Free elections were held in 1990, won by the center-right Hungarian Democratic Forum, and Josef Antall Jr. was elected as the new prime minister, marking Hungary's peaceful return to multi-party democracy and full independence.
And perhaps the most powerfully symbolic event of the entire end of the Cold War, German unification and the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Absolutely iconic. Tensions between East and West Germany had been, of course, a central feature of the Cold War since 1949. The thaw, the real beginning of the end for the division of Germany, came rapidly in 1989. This coincided, as the source notes, with a visit by Mikhail Gorbachev to West Germany, during which he signaled that Moscow would not use force to prop up the increasingly unpopular and isolated hardline East German regime. Helmut Kohl was the long-serving chancellor in West Germany, while Erich Honecker had led East Germany rigidly since 1971.
There was growing opposition within East Germany itself by this time, wasn't there?
Yes, fueled partly by the examples of reform in Poland and Hungary, and inspired by Gorbachev's glasnost. Opposition movements, often sheltered by institutions like the Protestant Church, which had support from churches in West Germany, began to grow bolder. Groups like the New Forum emerged, demanding reforms and freedom of travel. Mass protests, particularly centered in Leipzig, grew throughout the autumn of 1989. East Germans also started leaving the country in large numbers via Hungary, which had opened its border with Austria.
The regime was losing control.
Completely, facing immense internal pressure, mass emigration, and crucially sensing no political or military backing from Moscow anymore, the ruling Socialist Unity Party removed Erich Honecker from power in October 1989. He was replaced by Egon Krenz, who hoped to manage the crisis through limited reforms.
But it was too late. Events took on a momentum of their own, leading to that iconic moment in November.
Yes. As the pressure continued to build, with huge demonstrations demanding free travel and political change, on the evening of November 9, 1989, an East German official, Günter Schabowski, mistakenly announced in a press conference that new travel regulations allowing citizens to cross the border would take effect immediately.
Immediately.
He seemed unsure himself, but the news spread like wildfire. Huge crowds of East Berliners gathered at the checkpoints along the Berlin Wall, demanding to be let through. The border guards, confused and lacking clear orders, eventually opened the gates.
And the wall came down.
In an incredible, spontaneous, joyous celebration, people surged through, climbing onto the wall, chipping away at it with hammers and chisels. It was an unbelievable night, broadcast live around the world, symbolizing the end of decades of division and the collapse of communist control in Eastern Europe.
A truly powerful, spontaneous event marking the end of an era.
It was. And the fall of the wall spurred an immediate and unstoppable movement towards German unification. Negotiations proceeded rapidly between the two German states and the four former occupying powers, US, USSR, UK, France. Less than a year later, in October 1990, Germany was formally reunified.
And the first elections in United Germany.
Held in December 1990, Helmut Kohl's center-right Christian Democratic Union, CDU-CSU alliance, won a clear victory over the Social Democrats, making Kohl the first chancellor of the reunited German nation.
Amazing. Finally, let's revisit Czechoslovakia. It also saw a dramatic shift away from communism, albeit through a remarkably nonviolent transition the source calls a velvet revolution. But it's also the place where the Brezhnev Doctrine was first really articulated and brutally applied.
Right. Czechoslovakia's Cold War experience was also complex. It was initially led after the 1948 coup by hardliners, including Antonin Novotny. In early 1968, Novotny was replaced as party leader by Alexander Dubček, a Slovak reformer, who initiated a period of dramatic liberalization known as the Prague Spring.
Dubček had these ideas of creating communism with a human face, didn't he? What did that involve?
It involved significant reforms aimed at decentralizing the economy, increasing political freedoms, and crucially, abolishing censorship. Dubček tried to assure Moscow that Czechoslovakia would remain socialist and loyal to the Warsaw Pact, but the pace and scope of the reforms alarmed the Soviet leadership under Brezhnev.
And Brezhnev in Russia had a very different, much harder line compared to Khrushchev when it came to allowing freedom or autonomy to the satellite states.
He absolutely did. As the source notes, Brezhnev was not as keen on reforms and freedom to satellite states as was Khrushchev. He strongly believed in maintaining strong control over East Europe. Stability, ideological conformity, and unquestioned Soviet dominance were paramount for him and the Kremlin leadership. They saw the Prague Spring as a dangerous deviation that could potentially spread to other bloc countries and undermine Soviet control.
And to crush Dubček's reforms and keep Czechoslovakia firmly under control, Brezhnev ordered a military invasion.
Yes. In August 1968, Warsaw Pact forces, primarily Soviet, but also including Polish, East German, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops, invaded Czechoslovakia. There was widespread passive resistance from the Czech and Slovak population, but they couldn't stop the overwhelming military force. The invasion abruptly ended the Prague Spring. Dubček and other reformist leaders were arrested and taken to Moscow.
And it was during this invasion, or immediately after, that the justification for it was formally articulated as the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Yes, exactly. The Brezhnev Doctrine, asserting the right of the Soviet Union and its allies to intervene in the internal affairs of another socialist country if socialism was deemed to be under threat, was outlined to justify this blatant military intervention. The source mentions it was most clearly outlined by a figure named S. Kovalev in an article in the Soviet newspaper Pravda in September 1968 entitled Sovereignty and the International Obligations of Socialist Countries.
So the doctrine wasn't just a theory, it was applied with overwhelming force in Czechoslovakia.
Absolutely. It sent a clear message. Moscow would not tolerate significant deviation from its line within the bloc. Following the invasion, Dubček was forced to reverse the reforms and was eventually replaced by Gustav Husak, a hardline loyalist approved by Moscow. Husak presided over a period of rigid control and political repression known as normalization, ruling Czechoslovakia until 1987.
And Czechoslovakia's path to freedom came much later, only after the entire Soviet system began to collapse elsewhere.
Yes. It was only in late 1989, inspired by the fall of the Berlin Wall and events in Poland and Hungary, that Czechoslovakia experienced its Velvet Revolution. Huge, peaceful demonstrations filled the streets of Prague and other cities, demanding an end to communist rule. The communist government, facing overwhelming popular pressure and knowing Moscow would no longer intervene, peacefully relinquished power.
And Václav Havel became the new leader.
Yes, Václav Havel, the dissident playwright, who had been imprisoned under Husak, became the symbol of the revolution and was elected president by the parliament, marking a peaceful transition to democracy. Interestingly, the country later peacefully dissolved into two independent states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, in 1993.
And the final dissolution of the USSR itself, the end of the empire.
As we mentioned, the era of Gorbachev's reforms ultimately culminated in 1991 with the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union. The 15 constituent republics, from the Baltics to Central Asia, declared their independence. Gorbachev resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. He was succeeded as the leader of the newly independent Russia by Boris Yeltsin.
What was the Yeltsin era like?
Yeltsin oversaw the initial, often chaotic transition to a market economy and a more democratic political system in Russia. The source notes he gave the economy a boost in some ways through liberalization, but it was also a period of great economic hardship and instability for many Russians. After serving 2 terms, Yeltsin handed power at the end of 1999 to his chosen successor, Vladimir Putin.
And the source notes the Putin era as marking Russia's reemergence as a significant power player in the world, albeit in a completely new post-communist global landscape.
A different kind of power, certainly.
Okay, that brings us almost to the end of our deep dive. We've covered a huge amount of ground. Now, let's step back and look at how this tumultuous period, the entire Cold War saga, reshaped some fundamental concepts in international relations itself. The source starts by making a basic point. Modern societies are primarily organized as nation-states, and these remain the core actors in international relations.
That's the foundational concept, really. And these nation-states operate based on the logic of sovereignty. Traditionally, as the source highlights, this has meant that outside intervention in a state's domestic affairs is considered not welcome. It's the principle of non-interference. Sovereign states are headed by sovereign masters, governments. They interact through diplomacy and are theoretically bound by international law.
The source then traces how international law and statecraft evolved in the centuries leading up to the Cold War. Back in the 18th century, the primary goal was maintaining a balance of power.
Right. Statecraft was largely the domain of strong European monarchies and their professional diplomats. They used treaties, alliances, and sometimes limited wars, all aimed at preventing any single state from becoming too dominant and potentially threatening the others. It was about maintaining equilibrium in the system.
And key treaties cemented this idea.
Yes, the source points to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the incredibly destructive 30 Years' War. It's often considered the bedrock of the modern state system because it enshrined the principle of state sovereignty and territorial integrity. Later, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which settled another series of European wars, explicitly declared the balance of power as the core instrument of harmony.
And historical examples show this system in action, states constantly maneuvering to ensure systemic balance. For example, during the long decline of the Ottoman Empire and the simultaneous rise of the British and Russian empires.
Then came a major disruption. The French Revolution in the late 18th century. It introduced this radical, powerful idea that sovereignty rests with the people and not the ruler. This unleashed the force of national self-determination, the idea that nations, groups of people sharing a common identity, should have their own states across Europe. This fundamentally challenged the old system based on monarchical legitimacy and balance of power between dynasties.
After Napoleon's defeat, Napoleon representing the expansionist urge of the French Revolution, the European powers tried to put the genie back in the bottle, didn't they?
They certainly tried. Wary of the revolutionary forces and the potential for another dominant power emerging, the major European powers formed the Concert of Europe after 1815. This was an institutional attempt to maintain the balance of power and, importantly, to suppress revolutionary and nationalist movements that threatened the established order.
Did it work?
It brought a period of relative peace among the major European powers for several decades. But, as the source critically notes, it also coincided with and legitimized the domination of Europeans in Africa and Asia during the peak era of 19th century colonialism. And ultimately, the concert system couldn't contain the underlying rivalries and nationalism that exploded into World War I.
The catastrophe of World War I led to a fundamental shift towards a new concept for maintaining peace.
Yes, the Concert of Europe was seen as having failed. After WWI, the dominant belief among idealists, particularly U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, was that the old balance of power system, with its secret alliances and power politics, was actually one of the causes of war. So they tried something new. The League of Nations, established in 1919.
Which the source calls the first universal international body. What was its core idea?
The League aimed to replace balance of power with the concept of collective security. The idea was that instead of states forming competing alliances to balance each other, all member states would collectively guarantee the security of each member. An attack on one would be considered an attack on all, and the League would organize a collective response, hopefully deterring aggression in the first place.
And it had wider membership than the Concert of Europe.
Yes. Unlike the exclusively European concert, the League was intended to be global, based on wider international membership, including non-European nations, reflecting the changing world. Of course, as we know, the League ultimately failed to prevent aggression in the 1930s and the outbreak of World War II, leading to its replacement by the United Nations after that war, which built upon but also modified the concept of collective security.
Okay, and finally, the source brings us right up to the post-Cold War era, highlighting a more recent concept that directly challenges traditional notions of sovereignty, particularly relevant in our globalized world. It talks about alternative sovereignty and the responsibility to protect, or R2P.
Right. Since the end of the Cold War, globalization has intensified dramatically economic interdependence, global communication, the rise of non-state actors. This has deeply impacted the ability of states to act in complete isolation or with total autonomy. The source argues this is affecting general decision-making and fueling arguments for a new definition of sovereignty.
The traditional definition being, as we've said, strict non-intervention in a state's domestic affairs. What happens inside your borders is your business.
Exactly. That's the Westphalian ideal. But the newer idea, which gained significant traction particularly in the late 1990s and early 2000s, partly in response to failures to prevent mass atrocities in places like Rwanda and the Balkans, is that a state's sovereignty isn't just about rights. It also entails fundamental responsibilities. Specifically, a state has a primary responsibility for protecting its citizens from the worst kinds of harm.
So sovereignty isn't absolute permission to do whatever a government wants to its own people?
That's the core idea behind R2P. If a state is manifestly failing in that primary responsibility, if it's unable or unwilling to protect its own population from mass atrocity crimes like genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity,
And the principle of non-intervention can be overridden.
then, according to the R2P doctrine, the principle of non-intervention is reinterpreted. It yields to an international responsibility to protect. The idea is that if a country is failing its people so catastrophically, and if the UN Security Council, which holds the authority under the UN Charter for maintaining international peace and security, is convinced that the sovereignty of the people is violated in this extreme way, then the wider international community has a collective responsibility to intervene.
Intervention could mean different things, presumably.
Yes, R2P envisages a range of measures, starting with diplomatic pressure, sanctions, humanitarian assistance.
Yeah.
But ultimately, if those fail, it can include the authorization of coercive measures, potentially including military force as a last resort, specifically to protect the civilian population under threat.
And the source cites a specific, relatively recent example where this doctrine was invoked as justification for intervention.
The military intervention in Libya in 2011, authorized by UN Security Council Resolution 1973, is often cited as a case where the R2P doctrine was explicitly used as a justification for international military action. The stated goal was to protect Libyan civilians from attacks by Muammar Gaddafi's regime during the Libyan civil war. However, the implementation and consequences of that intervention remain highly debated and controversial, highlighting the ongoing challenges and complexities surrounding the R2P concept in international relations today.
Okay, wow. That was quite the deep dive, wasn't it? We started way back in the ruins of post-World War II Europe. We navigated those initial cracks that appeared almost immediately at Yalta and Potsdam.
hmm We saw how the Iron Curtain descended, largely due to Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, cementing the division.
Then we looked at how doctrines like the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan solidified the Western response, the strategy of containment.
And we revisited those incredibly intense flashpoints, the Berlin blockade and the amazing airlift, the brutal Korean War, the long, agonizing U.S. struggle in Vietnam, and of course the terrifyingly close call of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Seeing how these global crises forced adaptations, realignments led to periods of détente, but also renewed tensions.
Right. And then we traced the eventual surprisingly rapid collapse of the Soviet system itself, driven by Gorbachev's internal reforms, colliding with those powerful movements for independence in satellite states like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia.
Leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, just incredible moments in history.
Absolutely. And finally, we connected all this dramatic history back to the evolution of core international relations concepts, from the old balance of power system to the ideal of collective security, and right up to the modern ongoing debates about state sovereignty and this idea of the responsibility to protect.
So you've just gotten a real shortcut, a guided tour through decades of absolutely pivotal global history. We've tried to pull out the key moments, the key concepts, and really explore why they fundamentally mattered in shaping the world that you and I live in today.
It's a history filled with incredibly complex motivations, clashing ideologies, powerful leaders, popular movements, and that constant, often dangerous interplay between national interests and the search for some kind of global order.
So here's something for you to maybe ponder, building directly on that final point the source raised about sovereignty and intervention. Consider this tension it describes. On the one hand, you have traditional state sovereignty, the idea that what a government does within its own borders is basically its own business, free from outside interference, that Westphalian ideal. And on the other hand, you have this newer concept of the responsibility to protect, R2P, which suggests that sovereignty actually entails responsibilities, particularly the responsibility of a state to protect its own people from mass atrocities. And if a state fails, drastically fails, in that duty, then maybe external intervention becomes justified, even necessary.
It's a fundamental tension.
It really is. So think about how you see these competing principles, non-intervention versus R2P, playing out in global events and debates today. Maybe when you read about humanitarian crises, civil wars, or international responses to them. And then reflect back on the history we've just discussed. What does the Cold War, with its examples ranging from the strict non-intervention implied by the Iron Curtain to the assertive interventionism of the Brezhnev Doctrine, and then the complex debates around places like Vietnam or Cuba? What does all that history tell us about the real-world limits and perhaps the possibilities of external action? And what does this suggest about the enduring power, or maybe the changing nature, of state sovereignty itself in the 21st century?
Definitely something to mull over long after our deep dive today.